Welcome back everyone to yet another screencast. Today we will learn how to use Redux using hooks because hook functions are awesome. They're easy to use and easy to understand. Using Redux in a class-based component system was also very confusing and requires a long learning curve. However, if you want to learn the class-based Redux integration, then I have a video on that as well. I'll put this link in the description of this video as well. In this video, I have demonstrated Redux a little bit more than that I will do today. But anyhow, since you are watching this video, I'll assume that you have some idea about Redux. So in short, Redux makes it easy to manage the state of your application, and it helps you manage the data you display and how you respond to the user actions. You don't have to drill through all of your components and pass data towards to them from parents to children's just to maintain this reactivity and take actions based on your data that is coming from the state. So Redux handles these things very smartly for us, and hook is one of the new feature of React that allow you to access things like state, React lifecycle methods, and other cool stuffs in function components that were previously only available in the class-based components. If you want to learn more about React hooks, I have a video tutorial on this as well. I'll put this link in the description of this video. And in this video, I have discussed about the fundamental knowledge of React hooks and also demonstrated how to use states and component life cycles using these React hook functions like useState or useEffects. Very recommended video if you are not still into the React hook ecosystem. Pause this video and watch that first. And also, today I will start using the same Git repository of this React hook tutorial video. The first step is to install Redux and React Redux, which is the official React bindings for Redux. To do that, all you have to do is open the terminal on the folder where you have cloned the repository or created a new React project perhaps. npm install and Redux. This is the Redux core library, and then also install the React-Redux. So here React Redux is basically the official React bindings for Redux. Primarily they provide us three hook functions, that is useSelector and useDispatch and useStore. They have a very good documentation on this as well, so it is also recommended that you check their documentation page to learn more about them after watching this video. If you know the class-based component React Redux implementation, then useSelector is the map state to props, and useDispatch is basically map dispatch to props, and useStore is basically just the way we used to export the store initialization and later on being able to dispatch some actions directly using that store object. And the npm installation is done, so I will start the server again. Npm run start, and once the server is started, you will see pretty much something like this. Now the first thing that we will do is to create a new directory called store inside of the src directory. Now what I like to do is to do everything regarding the Redux inside of this store directory. Just make it a little more manageable. Now I'm going to create a new file here called initialdata.js. In my previous video, the class-based implementation, I probably called it a schema, and it seems like that people got confused what schema really is. So schema and initial data is serving the same purpose. Our example is going to be basically a counter. As our initial data, we're going to only export an object that has a property called counter with the default value of 0. So export default, counter, 0. Save it. Now, the next step will be to create an action file for the counter. So I'm going to create a new file here called actions.js. It will export a function called increment counter. Export increment counter. That will take a payload, and we will just return a new object that has a type called increment. There's a typo there. And also, do not get confused with this shorthand code I've written here. It is basically returning an object that has only one property called type with the value of increment. As we are going to dispatch the action called increment counter, the action function will return this object that will have the type of increment. Now Redux will scan through all of our reducers and it will match with the reducer, and when it found the increment reducer, it will execute that for us. So now obviously it's time that we write our first reducer to handle this increment action. Now I'm going to create a new file here called reducers.js. It will export a counter reducer function that takes an state. As initial value, we are going to set that null, and the action. So this action will contain exactly this object, and as this object has this property called type, we can access action.type as well. With that being said, I'm going to write a switch case here with action.type, and when it is increment, then we will return state +1, and in the default case we will return the state. This state value is basically depends how we combine these reducers that we will see after a few seconds. But before we go there, let's discuss a little about that. In this function, the state means this counter property. So when you say state +1, it is basically saying counter +1 behind the scene. And if we do not have any matching case, then by default it will return the value of the counter. Now that we have our building blocks for this store, we have the actions, we have the initial data, we have the reducer. Now let's create the store file. I'll create a index.js file here. This is the root file of our store, and I'll import two helper functions from Redux, which is one of them is create store and another one is combine reducers. From Redux. Now let's import our initial data from initial data, and we will also need to import the reducer that we have. We have only one reducer. Let's import that. Counter reducer from reducers. So counter reducer is basically this function right here. Now this is the most important part, that how we combine the reducers. Constant reducers is equals to combine reducer, and as you can see, combine reducers is coming from the Redux library. As its argument, we're going to pass an object that will have the counter property, and for the counter property that we also have in the initial data, so we are telling Redux to send this property to this reducer, right? So counter goes to counter reducer. Save that, and now we will export the actual Redux store. Export default, create store. As its first argument, we are passing in function. It's going to be state, action, and the reducers. And on the second argument, we are going to pass all the initial data. And now that we have our Redux store ready, it is time that we prepare the index.js file. Now we need to first import provider from React Redux. So import provider from React Redux. And then we will need to import this store that we have just created from store. So whatever we have exported from this index.js file is being assigned to this store variable right here. So now we have to wrap our app component using the provider component. like that. And in the store props of the provider component, we will simply pass our store. And now we are good to go. Now let's consume the data from Redux store. Going to the app.js component, and the app.js component is already too big to write on it again. So I'm gonna create a new component here in the source directory that I'm gonna call Redux counter. Redux counter.js, import React from React. First of all, check everything is working. So export default. Alright, so in the app.js component, we are going to import the Redux counter component. And let's say after this one, I'm gonna add a h2. Let's say it works. So our very simple function component is working. Let's integrate Redux in this function components. To get started, we need to import a couple of helper functions from React Redux. The first one is useSelector. React Redux, save it. And here we are basically going to consume the state. So I'm just gonna simply say a variable called count, useSelector, and we pass the state, and we tell it to consume the property that we're looking for, that is state.counter. And now let's print that count variable. Count, and save it. And as you can see, count is 0. And if you want to further verify or validate, you can go to the initial data and change it, and it will also change the count value here as well. So our Redux store state is working perfectly. Now it's time we make use of the action dispatcher. To do that, at first we need to import the useDispatch hook function from React Redux. Now let's initialize the dispatcher. I'm just going to declare a new variable called dispatch with the useDispatcher, with the useDispatch function. Now let's add a new button here, call it increment, and on click we are going to dispatch the action, right? Which action? This one, increment counter. So let's import increment counter here. Say import increment counter from store and actions. So within the dispatch function, we are going to pass the increment counter action as well. Now save it, and if you click on the increment button, it should increment the value, and it does. That means our Redux store is working using the hook ecosystem of React. So we have learned how to use useSelector hook function to consume the state from the Redux store, and how to use the useDispatch hook function to dispatch an action. Before we end this video, there's one little caveat using the useSelector, as the useSelector hook function differs from the map state to props in one big way, and that is the useSelector hook function uses strict object reference equality to determine if components should re-render instead of shallow object comparison, and as a result, the component will re-render on every store update. To solve this problem, we can use shallowEqual function from React Redux library. So let's import shallowEqual. If you only consume one property of the state, then using shallowEqual is not that required. But to give you an idea, In a real-world application, you will consume stores that had multiple nested properties. So here's how you can use the shallowEqual method just as the second argument of the useSelector hook function. And that's pretty much it. Let's test our application. It is working. So yes, that's pretty much all for today. I'll upload this code to a new repository, and if this video helps, let me know in the comment section, because your feedbacks will be helpful for me to progressively improve the quality of my videos. I'm also available on Twitter. My handle is @RocketTG. Subscribe to my YouTube channel. Thanks, and see you around.